Hi, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to Let's Talk ETC. I'm your host, Carlo V, along with my co-host, Dr. Christian Severino. Christian's been filling in for me for the last 5 or 6 shows. So, Christian, thanks a ton for being there. Guys, I was over in Japan, Shanghai, and Malta. Japan, they just pushed through, completely accepting Bitcoin as a form of payment. Shanghai, everybody's into blockchain and Bitcoin and all sorts of stuff. And the ETC community over there is awesome. And Malta, I was over there for the Financial Cryptography Conference. And there's just so much cool work being done in the space right now. So just wanted to give you guys a brief overview of, where I've been the last few months. And it's just really exciting to see where the space is going. Also, I wanted to touch upon, especially in Shanghai, there was 3 buildings full of accelerators just doing all sorts of stuff and a whole bunch of blockchain accelerator stuff going on over there. So also, just to touch upon a couple of things in reference to ETC, it's great to be back. And just to fill you guys in on what's been going on this last week, we have 2 additional developers joining the ETC dev team. And also, if anyone saw the news about Stampery using Ethereum, just to let everybody know, they're actually using the ETC chain, which is really exciting. Check out the ETC newsletter, which was just released this week on the 13th for a bunch of ETC news and info. And also check out ETC Today that has a bunch of articles and new stuff that's going on in the ETC community. So to get down into it, I'd like to introduce everybody to Joel Dietz of Swarm Fund and also Agentic. That's correct, Joel? Agentic, right?
Yeah, Agentic Group.
So I met Joel at Coin Agenda last year in Vegas, and this guy's involved in a whole bunch of blockchain, stuff, and he's just a pillar in the community and doing all sorts of stuff all over the world. Really cool guy, great ambassador for blockchain, and working on a lot of awesome projects. So great to have you on your show, Joel. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, very happy to be here.
Yeah, definitely. So, yeah. So, Joel, kind of, if you could just give everybody a little bit of a background on, your general background and kind of how you got into tech, I guess.
Yeah, sure. I was one of these, child prodigy programmers, started programming at age 6, started, taking computer science classes at a local college at age 14 and, that sort of stuff. So I was familiar with a number of different tech stacks and things like that. Kind of eventually moved on to doing some enterprisey software architect stuff where it became more about the overall system design rather than any specific technological implementation. And it was around then that I was sort of initially a Bitcoin skeptic, to be honest. And then after reviewing other attempted digital currency things, I understood why Bitcoin had been successful when other digital currency attempts hadn't been. And it largely has to do with, legal and regulation stuff. And then when the Ethereum white paper came out, I just had what I call a nerdgasm. I read that. I was like, wow, the smart contract stuff can open up so much. And being for a long time in the nonprofit sector, really interested in kind of public goods problems and, things like how do you save the rainforest and, how do you create, good overall ecosystem things that encourage innovation. And so the idea that some of this smart contract technology could be used to solve some of these public goods problems was extremely exciting to me. And I started writing about reputational network systems, how the future of organizational design. I started doing some evangelism for Ethereum, created this sort of Silicon Valley Ethereum group with Christian Peel, created Ethercasts, an online educational smart contract channel with Joris Bonche, and just really was put all my energy into that. So that was sort of the initial whoa, blockchain is something really real and exciting.
Yeah. Like when it clicked, I guess we all have that clicked moment.
Yeah.
I think it's funny that no, go ahead.
I just say I went from a sort of vague appreciation of Bitcoin, but not like a significant. I never made a significant investment to being like, wow, Ethereum is really groundbreaking and exciting at both a technological level and at like a world global impact level.
Yeah. So
definitely.
Can I say something? So
Yeah,
Joel, it's kind of interesting because what you described. So you started out as a programmer, and some people's style is that they like to keep their head down and write massive amounts of code. But it sounds like then you diverged into other, like thinking about the big picture and education. And so I kind of see myself kind of similar to that. I like programming, but then I also like thinking of, I don't know how you describe the education, the bigger issues at hand here. So I think we're kindred spirits in a sense there.
Yeah. In that particular case, it was driven by, business needs in the organizations I was in, where we had a lot of programmers who were very good at coding within their respective spheres, whether it was, front end JavaScript or, various types of system level things. And there weren't a lot of people who could put the whole connecting pieces together and also bring in, large contracts to explain how these technologies could be used to solve needs that existed elsewhere. So that was sort of how my career evolved very organically in that direction, I would say.
Okay, cool. Very nice.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we had a chance to talk a lot about ETC while I was over in Vegas, which was pretty awesome. So that was a pretty interesting conversation between me, you, and I believe it was Philip, right?
Yeah, Philip Piper is one of my key business partners here at the moment.
Yeah. Philip was a cool guy. Joel's a great guy.
Joel, I do have one other question, just for fun.
Yeah.
That I wanted to ask you. So this idea of looking at the big picture and thinking about the future and that kind of path, sometimes I would have jobs where they just wanted the type of person that keeps his head down and bangs out boring code. And sometimes I would be thinking of, my mind would be in all these other places, and I would get bored to death with jobs. And I was wondering if you kind of had that experience, that sometimes you get bored really easily and you can't do certain tedious jobs because your mind's always thinking of other things.
Yes and no. I have a couple academic degrees and, good grades and things like that. So I have known that, at times there's times where you just got to buckle down and say, hey, I have to generate this, 30-page report on, esoteric poetry in the 15th century or something like that. And then that is a task that requires a lot of focus. And then there are times when you can kind of rewind a little bit and look at kind of big picture things. And in fact, a lot of the early implementations of Ethereum, like systems that I was involved in, I noticed that there was no one really rewinding to look at the big picture, and that they were just like, hey, let's grind out a lot of code looking at the decentralized energy market, for example, and how all the pieces would fit together. I was involved in, I think, 2 or 3 of the earliest attempts to do that. And I pointed out, hey guys, you don't have the actual economics of these systems figured out. Like, there are some core little problems here that you're definitely going to have to solve for this system to actually work. And well, I was with actually just didn't want to hear that. They were like, no, we're just going to write the code and the clients are willing to pay for it. And, and I was like, well, then, it's not really clear it's a business. It's not really clear it's going to actually work, even if the code works, because, the economics may not work. Mm-hmm. But so sometimes it's not a voice that people don't want to hear when you're able to do that. And I think that's something that's caused a little bit of distance between me and some other people in the Ethereum world, because I'm happy to participate in hype cycles, but at the fundamentals, I want to see very clear value that's delivered. So,
yeah.
So I guess this is a good time to add, you're talking about the differences you have between Ethereum and the Ethereum world and stuff like that. So in reference to Ethereum Classic or, ETC, I know you've had, plenty of suggestions for the ETC community, and something you're like really good at. Now, I'm looking at a white paper right now that's in reference to liquid democracy, which is, a hot topic for ETC these days, as far as what direction the community wants to go in or doesn't want to go in. So what are some of your thoughts or some things you have to say to the blockchain community about liquid democracy and governance systems and stuff like that?
I mean, I run a group on that and carry a lot. So ultimately, I have a lot to say about that topic.
We got time.
Start simple.
Yeah, let's start simple. So what are some things like let's say you were all about let's say you just had a huge chunk of ETC and you wanted to see it go in a particular direction. You're the emperor of ETC. I guess, which is something nobody wants, obviously, since this is a decentralized community and there's so many different people. But for hypothetical, just what are the things you, in your like expert opinion, will say that you'd like to see, or things that you suggest for the ETC community or any blockchain community for that matter?
Well, like many people who are in the blockchain world, I like to see things appreciate in value. I like to see technological innovation, and I like to see things that are like exciting to me. So the participates I participate in tend to be the ones that I feel like are really making some significant impact through the technology that they're building, and I personally have been. I don't want to say disappointed because I know things take their time, but I have always wanted to see large scale DApp systems that provide real value, and the fact that there's been a few things, that are interesting in the Ethereum world, and I follow them, and tons of interesting prototypes and concepts and stuff like that have come out. But as far as like working dApps that are providing a significant service and value, like we don't even really have the Satoshi dice of, Ethereum yet. And, that was like maybe not the most amazing, innovative thing ever in the Bitcoin world, but it was something that a lot of people used and kind of enjoyed playing with and, and did something at least that provided some kind of, at least showed the world that something could be done there. So that's something that, I think is like, I don't know, this was maybe temperamentally, but I like to have those things that have that kind of coherent value. And so if I was the emperor of ETC, that's probably where I would like push things, because, the Ethereum Foundation and everyone else is doing a great job at building these like enterprise consortiums and, making friends with, all of these big companies. And I think that's very valuable in and of itself, particularly for the name recognition of Ethereum more broadly, which probably benefits ETC as well. Frankly, I think that's like, as far as the ultimate thing that's what I would say. It really would be the same thing for Ethereum itself. If I had a greater degree of control there, I would emphasize the functional implementations that had sort of real users, as well as how to get capital behind them, that kind of, because that's another thing is, you have to encourage entrepreneurs to get out there and build something and be appropriately vested in the kind of result, and have, because sometimes it's like ETC, the token will benefit as long as the projects benefit, and then the individual project owners will benefit. So those things all kind of have to be aligned with each other. So
can I say something? So I think one of the things you said was that you want the blockchain space to keep growing, and you said you especially are interested in large smart contracts, DAOs as they're called, distributed autonomous organizations. Do you think that that'll happen just organically, that people will first do simple contracts and then make better tools to design smart contracts, and then they'll slowly get more complex, but we're just at the beginning stages, and that's why we don't have the super complex smart contracts today?
I think it's a number of things. One of them, and I guess I'll just be a critical but hopefully educated voice here, is that when you're doing certain types of software delivery, you need to have a high degree of like internal quality control kind of as you go along. And I don't know if that was always done in the kind of actual implementation, for instance, with the Solidity language itself, or that there are too many kind of breaking changes made over time so that, things are always a little bit in flux, and then new potentially catastrophic errors can kind of surface along the way. So that is something that is problematic because, if you're building for long term, you want the building blocks that you're building with to be very secure so that then you can build things, that are secure on top of it. Whereas if the building blocks themselves are in flux and not particularly well audited and controlled and things like that, then as soon as you go out to build something with Solidity, if you're not sure that the compiler is working correctly, then, the whole thing can blow up regardless of whether or not you made an error, because the compiler itself can have an error in it. Yeah, so that's a huge problem for anyone building in this ecosystem at all. And, and ultimately it's like a quality control issue. It's like, at that low level, do we actually have the quality control that we can be sure that these things are working? And obviously, if you can't, then you can't build large dApps. You can't even really build small dApps that are production ready. Right. It doesn't matter the size,
Yeah. So I think would you agree? So the DAO was almost something like the DAO was almost inevitable, a blow up like that, and then everybody now says, okay, now we better rethink how we do smart contract programming, and so now people are looking into functional programming and all these other techniques to make more secure contracts.
I don't know if it was inevitable. It was maybe inevitable given the way that the system evolved, in the sense that, there was a lot of breaking changes made along the way without a lot of necessarily auditing and attention to those things. I don't know if the Ethereum Foundation could have done that better. I don't particularly have a strong desire to be a critic of the Ethereum Foundation or any of the process they use. I wasn't intimately involved in that. I did offer to be at a couple of points, and but I wasn't ultimately involved in any of those decisions. So I don't know. It's hard to say, but given the whole way that the ecosystem worked and the hype cycles and everything else, yes, it was inevitable that a bunch of hype would be poured onto something that at the low level did not have secure building blocks underneath it, and that it would explode and then kind of cause this larger problem for the whole, kind of system.
Yeah.
So I know what you mean.
How does your liquid democracy project, how does that help with making better and more sophisticated smart contracts, or does it touch some other aspect that I'm not aware of?
Well,
I'd say it's more governance related, I suppose. Is that right?
Yeah, but I mean, the two are related in the sense that the Ethereum basically chose a nonprofit foundation in Switzerland as its governance structure. And if I remember correctly, there were 9 board seats on that nonprofit board, and Vitalik had 3, and other people had the other 6. And that was basically how it made decisions. I don't know if it's been very well documented or publicized, but, it is a kind of core element in Ethereum. It's like, how does Ethereum Foundation make decisions? How does it decide whether or not to recommend a hard fork at any given moment? Obviously the miners and kind of how the miners are going to react is very important. But also there are people who are basically responsible legally and otherwise for making certain types of decisions. So that structure and who's on that board and all of that are kind of critical components. And it's possible with, different structures that you have just different results based on the nature of that structure. So for instance, if you put only developers on that board, you're going to get a certain type of results because it's going to be totally driven by tech people. If you put only regulators or bankers, for that matter, on that board, totally different type of decisions that those people are going to make. And, ultimately, I think you want some alignment between the desire of people, for instance, in Ethereum, which is a crowd sale, and what those people's desires are and expectations were. So that they're generally fulfilled with the structure, with the governance structure. So that
sorry.
Yeah, just saying, like,
go ahead.
Liquid. Let me just finish this thought. So liquid democracy potentially, at least, allows some kind of reconciliation of that, in the sense that it can be a little bit more of an organically evolving governance structure. And frankly, Vitalik suggested similar things around having a DAO govern Ethereum instead of a foundation. But I don't know if that's feasible at this point anymore. But he did suggest that at some point. To have the structural thing be aligned so that basically the people who care about the network are the people and have vested stake in the network. I think you've seen the white paper. There's also this sense of like locking in your stake for an extended period of time to show that, you're actually having, a long-term stake in the network instead of just some coins today that you plan to sell tomorrow. But that to have those people who have the long-term stake actually be those who are participating directly in the decision making. Yeah. So, and in that sense, like, you don't have to necessarily know, or like think that exactly what those people want. You can just act them because you're not even asking them; they are deciding themselves what happens with the future of that organization. So that's the idea behind it.
Okay, here's what I really wanted to ask you. I think I know a way to make it more concrete. So in addition to bad technology blowing up a blockchain, I think you would agree that the people, the organizational structure could blow up a blockchain. That's another thing to be concerned about. I'm thinking specifically of like the Bitcoin block size debate. So maybe this could make it more concrete. Suppose the Bitcoin community read your white paper and they believed in it, so they're going to do your liquid democracy, proposal. How could that conceivably help them with this debate that's never ending?
Well, interestingly enough, I tried to build a voting mechanism on the Bitcoin blockchain early on, knowing that it wouldn't be the best platform for building something like that because it's not really designed for it. But you can pass metadata along with Bitcoin transactions and do something like that, and it was functional. But the key part of what I'm describing is that it is a stake-weighted voting system. So it really depends on the stake that you have in the network that then, or whatever, a DAO structure that then makes it possible. So and interestingly enough, the Bitcoin Foundation could have done something like that. I don't think the Bitcoin, Foundation did anything particularly innovative, potentially ever, as far as I can tell. But at least at the technological level, besides maybe like figuring out how to like make money disappear. But unfortunately, I don't have a particularly high opinion of those people, and they never gave me any money for the work I did for them either. So I don't. But the ultimate kind of effect, that they could have done something like that. They could have said, hey, look, you are buying into the future of the Bitcoin Foundation, and we're going to set up a transparent voting mechanism where, depending on the stake that you have in Bitcoin, that's the stake that, you'll have in the decision making. And then we're going to basically organize the decisions on, for instance, how whatever Bitcoin Core does on this way, rather than having like, hey, one big company is going to hire a bunch of developers, and then that company is going to basically try and decide based on their, wisdom of their CEO or whatever other grounds, that this is the way Bitcoin should go. And I think it's, I think the whole thing is sad. I'm actually I'm watching these debates very carefully myself, because I think it's illustrative of a lot of things, but ultimately, I think there's a big problem in that once things are kind of already in motion, it's very hard to change direction. And it's actually sort of the reason, even with Ethereum, right? Ethereum has a foundation already. It's not like the foundation can necessarily just disappear. And that's one reason why I got excited about Ethereum Classic, is that it just sort of exists. It came out of existence out of nowhere. Without actually any clear way of deciding how it was going to evolve. So it's sort of like, well, there's actually less that's already been established in the case of Ethereum Classic than in many other places.
Yeah. Where would you like to see ideally crypto governance in, say, like 20 years? What's your fairy tale for crypto governance? Is it an amalgamation of something that you've got going and some other stuff you've heard about, or what's your vision for crypto governance in the distant future?
Well, I personally don't like voting, interestingly enough, even though I'm building voting systems, because it takes time and I have a lot of time to spend other things. And the main problem about voting is you need to usually have to educate yourself about the decision that you're making, or you feel like you're making a dumb decision. And that's like, I don't know what's going on in all the proposals in California, local city council, and, what's best for the global climate, water level, air, all these things. It's a lot of things to be educated about. So my hope is that we can figure out some system in the crypto world that sort of generally works for empowering people who really do know about those things, that are specialists in the area, and also have the best interests of the people they're representing in mind, that we can kind of have that be successful, for instance, for governing blockchain or kind of ecosystem in the crypto, and actually branch that out into the rest of the world to actually make a significant amount of impact around places that aren't doing a particularly good job of that at the moment.
Well, I was going to say, I also saw in your paper, you talked a lot about, delegated is kind of what you're talking about as far as having someone that is trusted to go over all these, because obviously we're in such the early stages. People can actually, like in Dash, people can vote, but when a chain gets big enough, there's just going to be so many things going on that some sort of delegated scheme is going to have to be developed. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Totally. And the experts as well can be humans, or they can be AI, or they can be some kind of fusion. I think ultimately there's a lot of type of things. Even driving is a good example. To some degree, there's a governance issue in my car every time I drive, because it's like, which way am I going to turn and how fast am I going to go? Those are decisions that need to be made. And I would gladly give that away, to someone else who was going to do that for me.
Right.
So to the extent to which, there can be intelligent, decision making that's done with a minimum of input on my part and some accountability for it. I think that those are sort of the broad goals I have. And I think liquid democracy, particularly, is a good system, not just because it's transparent and it allows delegation. Those are really good elements to it, but also because it does allow, for automation, and it can integrate with other elements like, Futarchy or some of these prediction market-based decision-making. Like, I'm very excited about some of these other things as well.
Yeah. So I think you would agree that, would you agree that, so to solve the direct democracy problem, which you mentioned, is that everybody has to become familiar with every bill that we have to vote on, the way that governments have solved it for centuries, right, is representative democracy, where we vote for people that we trust, and they are the subject matter experts that vote on our behalf. So there's a lot of precedent, I think, for what you're suggesting, which, representative democracy, basically. We'd have to discuss how to elect those representatives in a secure, safe way. But I think go ahead.
I was going to say, I think the cool thing about also the liquid democracies in crypto is the weight of each vote. Someone that has, a 5% stake in the network being able to make a larger portion of the decision than someone who has like one Satoshi.
Yes, but the obvious question the obvious question that the audience wants to ask, or I want to ask, is, well, so what's to stop some wealthy person then, an oligarchy, what people that have the most coins are going to dominate all the voting?
I mean,
go ahead, Joel. Sorry.
Yes, you're right. And actually, that's what happens already. You just maybe aren't aware of it, but at least in the United States, it's pretty obvious that that's what's going on. But they do it back channel through, campaign donations and other things like that, where it's not as transparent, or certain aspects aren't transparent. So I think in some ways, even if you just make this, now I don't particularly love the system as it currently exists, but I think that if you just made the system that as it exists today totally transparent, you would still be making huge improvement over what currently exists.
Okay. I think another big point, I think, okay, so in reference to the viewers wondering, or the listeners wondering about oligarchies and stuff like that, I think a lot of the oligarchy structure, Joel, correct me if I'm wrong, I think a lot of the oligarchy structure comes from almost a monopoly on power and the amount of inflation that they can create, in the sense that they don't raise taxes and they don't do this, that, and the other thing, but they end up just doing monetary inflation to fund all these crazy things that people wouldn't normally agree to. But with crypto, since you can't inflate it away, it's not like the network as a whole would agree to some of these insane things that governments, not just here, but governments all over the world, create this inflation to create these monstrous, machines of war and all these kinds of crazy things. What do you think, Joel?
Well, think of government as software. Obviously I'm a programmer, so it's natural for me to do that. But and software like Internet Explorer or something like that, 5.0, has exploits. People are designing exploits for it. They're going to figure out how they can install their spyware on top of it and, get you to click through the terms so that, it's like this biggest bloatware ever. And I think it's basically what we have today. And what you're describing is like this exploit that exists on central banks that like I can have my
exploit.
Yeah.
It's just...
it's basically what it is. It's like, oh, well, I'm going to go, this is what happened in 2008, and it'll probably happen again, in my opinion, in many places. But, oh my goodness, I'm going to go put my money in these highly risky things. It's all going to disappear, crash the whole economy. Please, like, can you just push the button that prints more money and sends it to me? And then it's like, oh, I guess we have to do that, So
honestly, that's one of the funniest things I've ever heard about central banking. Like the next time I'm online and I see someone having, how people get really heated and have like an emotional heart attack over it.
Yeah.
I'm just going to make like a really short post. I'm just going to say, it's just a hardware bug, bro. Or something.
Can I ask a question for Joel? I have a question for
Joel Deets.
I have a question for
Joel.
Joel.
Go ahead.
So I'm seeing parallels in just regular away from keyboard democracies here. So about the oligarchy problem. So my sense is that the rich and powerful don't have complete control, right? I'm thinking like of Brexit and the populist movements all over the world, now in France. And so if ETC had somebody that was wealthy, that was doing crazy things, presumably all us little plebeians would all get together and say, hey, we gotta all vote together to go against, right, this wealthy person that's messing things up. And so that happens in the real world. And so that would happen presumably in cryptocurrency space, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you have factions that build, and it's natural to have that over different interests, even if those interests are just, different opinions about priorities. So like, for instance, say Peter Thiel put money into our network democracy stack and Elon Musk put it in, and they each, say put in, I don't know, $50 million. And then, but Elon Musk thinks that we should prioritize going to Mars first, and Peter Thiel thinks we should like prioritize building like an island prototype government, in the Pacific or something, a floating island, And we're like, okay, like these are just priority. None of them is wrong per se. Personally, I support both initiatives. I think they're both really interesting things, and but yeah, their prioritization, and then people can kind of create factions around different things. And if Elon Musk and Peter Thiel team together, but together they only own 20% of the network, and then, you know, the rest of us can band together who own smaller part and then say, sorry guys, but we think it's way more important to actually just like build some public roads infrastructure in our own country before we build like a high-speed rail system, because we have a bunch of potholes, you know?
Yeah.
So,
So I think
true.
would you agree with me that so liquid democracy, blockchains in general, can improve the political process, but they're not necessarily going to remove all the messiness of human interaction, right, and debate. They're just going to improve it. Maybe it'll be harder to abuse and commit fraud in the blockchain space, but your people are still going to be people. It's not going to completely make a utopia.
That's true.
Avoid all. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I personally think conflict is a part of life, and generally speaking, a kind of positive thing in the sense that, you know, sometimes ideas need to be tested, you know, in the public sphere and go through a debate process, and, you know, maybe having high emotional content behind them is not always helpful, but yeah, it's a part of life. So the fact that this stuff, and you know, frankly, I enjoy playing like war games and things like that too. So like having little battles when ways that people aren't actually dying is probably not that bad either.
Yeah, you got to add me on Chess of Friends. I don't know.
Okay.
So I'm very what was I gonna say? Oh, so I guess now we have the 20-year, 10-year picture, which was pretty funny about your comment that inflation is just like a hardware bug or a software bug or whatever. But in reference to ETC, what are some suggestions?
I do want to clarify that since you're putting it in. So I don't think inflation is an interesting monetary policy question. What I specifically refer to is printing money and giving it to the people who are causing the financial crisis. So that I will say is a hardware bug.
Yeah, that's what I meant to say. Okay, so the bailout, the 2008 bailout was just a hardware bug, which is pretty funny. Because I don't mean literally inflation, since even, you know, Bitcoin, all the cryptocurrencies are basically inflating, I guess you could say, even though they have a capped limit. But in reference to ETC, Joel, like what are some suggestions or things you'd like to see from the ETC network that, or suggestions you have for, you know, anybody listening out there, or the community as a whole?
Well, I think for ETC to be continually relevant, you know, it needs to attract projects that are doing real things. So, and providing real value. I think the stampery thing that you guys mentioned is a great example of that. So just to show that it can be stable itself and have a good, you know, team behind it doing that. I think there's a great opportunity for doing something innovative in the realm of governance. You know, I saw the proposal that came back from IOHK, and, you know, it's kind of like the Dash model applied to Ethereum Classic, which, you know, to some degree has been done before and would be tricky to do an Ethereum Classic thing. So I have sort of mixed feelings about it, but I think there's an awesome opportunity for doing something actually innovative around governance. And in general, just trying to keep like a positive environment. You know, I think people from the main Ethereum community sometimes perceive, and I've heard this several times, Ethereum Classic as just being a bunch of traders who are trying to make money, or people who are like full of animosity towards whoever. And I think even if there's elements of those things, like it's not necessarily that helpful. It's better to focus on kind of, you know, the positive energy of doing something really innovative that's providing value to something. And then there can be a sort of differentiating point that Ethereum Classic has, opposed to the, you know, Ethereum Foundation supported version of it.
What are some of the suggestions you have in reference to the IOHK treasury model that was kind of, you know, like you said, based on Dash, but had some, you know, improvements to polls that they saw and tweaks and tips and stuff like that?
Well, I just thought that the whole embedding it in the blockchain level is very interesting, but kind of risky given where ETC is at the moment, and given the fact that they said it would take like a year to deploy and implement. So like, I don't know exactly what the timeline was. I'm not even sure there was like a full timeline presented for that. But that was my main kind of concern. And if you were going to do that, frankly, I think it would be better to do it on a clean Ethereum-based chain and do it as a test project, see how it works, and then, like kind of start from scratch with that type of model. So
can I ask a question about that? That actually ties into another question I wanted to ask you, which was, enforcement of voting. So obviously, if I decide tomorrow that I don't believe in paying my income taxes, the government has guns and they can come and make me do it even though I don't agree with it. And so we could make all these brilliant voting systems, and if people just say, well, I don't care what the vote, how it turned out, I'm just going to do what I want, and you would probably say, if I understood you correctly, that the stake, right? You're putting some skin in the game, and that's how you do enforcement. And so related to that, to what you guys were just talking about, the reason I think the treasury model, the thought was you have to put it at a lower level so that you can't just make it a smart contract that everybody ignores, right?
And I hosted a meetup on Dash. I have Dash, and I love that model. So at that level, I totally agree. It's just a tricky thing to implement technically, given the way that the blockchain exists today for Ethereum Classic. Important to keep in mind there, and Dash is a good example of this as well, is the positive incentive. So if you obviously collecting taxes is difficult, and particularly across the whole blockchain with existing stake, but if you can create some positive incentive, and this is sort of the liquid democracy DAO stuff with stake weighted is sort of meant to encourage this, is like, hey, you're buying a stake in the network, but that stake, can appreciate in value, if there's stuff that's being created, that part of that network that then, augments the value of the whole network. So in that sense, it's a sort of second layer, it would be like if you have something that is governing the protocol / lower level blockchain layer, that's kind of exists already, and that's being done. And then a separate thing that's sort of governing the application layer and incentivizing people to kind of build in that application layer. So that's how I saw kind of what we're doing. And, I haven't been super spending a lot of time in pushing it on the Ethereum Classic community. I did talk with Barry Silbert briefly, and I don't know if he totally understood what we were trying to do, but that's sort of the sort of way I've been approaching this conceptually.
Okay, so if I understood you correctly, you're saying that you could use positive incentives rather than negative. So presumably the analogy would be the government, instead of coming with guns to make me pay my income tax, they could say, well, if you do pay your income, everybody that pays their income tax gets a free car next year. That's a ridiculous example, but that's kind of what you're saying. I mean, that you don't need guns to make.
Sounds like cash for clunkers, actually. Kind of what they did.
Well, no, but it's actually like Alaska's example of that here in the United States, like or Norway for that matter. But hey, you move to Alaska, and then you get a share of all of the oil, whatever other revenue that's generated from Alaskan land. So they actually pass that back to Alaskan citizens.
Yeah. Rather than making a law that says there's a certain quota that has to move to Alaska every year.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. If you just forced everyone to go Alaska, that would be not very cool. Yeah.
The way I think of that with people from Alaska getting paid from the oil, I almost think of it like the land that they own, or the fact that they have an address is almost like a token to receive a dividend. I suppose that's kind of what that would be.
Yeah, that's how I think about it too. And in fact, making it sort of stake weighted makes a lot of sense. And say, well, depending on not just like the amount of land, but the amount of personal investment you put into making Alaska work, assuming it was starting from scratch, then has some proportional effect on the amount that you get back when you hit the oil.
That actually brings up another good point that I wanted to talk about from your white paper. Now I read some stuff about like tying it into real assets and land and stuff like that. So I don't know if you could expand upon that for anyone listening. Oh, also for anyone listening, we're going to post, Joel, is it good to post a link to the white paper in the description below? Or is this kind of still under wraps?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool.
I can even publish the latest version on GitHub so that you have an easy link to get to.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Cool. That would be great.
So
you're dealing with a hard problem. So I commend you for trying to tackle a difficult something that hasn't been solved yet. Right?
Sorry. Yeah. So it was in reference to the real assets.
Right. Yeah. I'll actually answer the second question first. Is like Vitalik really inspired me when I was organizing the Silicon Valley meetup, and we had a presentation from him on hard problems and crypto economics. And I just saw how he thinks about problems. And it is like, here are all the hardest problems, and, the securing underlying, Bitcoin blockchain layers and things like that. And I was like, started using similar methodology for, macroeconomics and other type of problems. We're just sort of, here are some big problems, and, maybe some of this new technology and stuff can be used to fix it. One that I've been knowledgeable about forever is, fiat currency. We were talking about it before, the fact that central banks can just print money, and they have a bad history of doing this, in crises, and sometimes just totally destroying their own economy as a result.
Yeah.
And creating the total wrong set of incentives in the economy as well. And one thing that has existed in the past is asset-backed currencies, gold and other things like that. But the interesting way that those things evolved, is that originally they had the gold. The gold itself is, fungible and scarce, and has a kind of intrinsic value. So the precious metals were a natural choice, and then they paperitized it. They digitized the gold, right? Effectively, except that they didn't have digital stuff; they had paper. So that's kind of how the process of evolution worked. And yet, there's kind of a more natural kind of source for hard, stable value, because gold actually doesn't have particularly stable value, and that is real estate, and particularly the land. It may appreciate in value. There are ways to get land that can appreciate in value fairly rapidly, but by and large, particularly if you have a large pool of real estate, and particularly with spread across multiple legal jurisdictions, other things like that, can be presumed to have a relatively stable value as an underlying asset base. So I happen to really like this because I'm not just a computer nerd, but I'm an economic and sort of geopolitical nerd. And there's a huge, problem in having a global stable unit of account, not just in Ethereum type, solutions where, you might want to have some kind of stable coin that you use to make your predictions in a prediction market or whatever else, things that it's like, your assets are denominated in and everything else like that. But within the sort of global economy as a whole, say I'm in some, economy where I'm not sure I trust the central bankers not to just print a bunch of money and then cause our economy to go hyperinflation, might make sense to actually park some of my money in something that is a more stable kind of hold of value. So that is something that I love as a concept, and this type of technology allows very concretely, in the sense that if you can have a sort of DAO-like structure, or the liquid democracy, to go out and purchase land, and then effectively the value of your shares in that liquid democracy becomes the value of the underlying assets, potentially plus the future value and the kind of, governance layer. But you have a kind of hard assets that are kind of underneath that. And one particular thing that is near and dear to my heart as well, and apparently some other people we're working with in Brazil now, is that it can be used for conservation of like rainforest and other things like that too, because people will buy into it, particularly high net worth individuals who are kind of socially conscious as well. They recognize, hey, look, I breathe air in every day. The reason I have air to breathe in is because there's these trees in the, Amazonian rainforest that are like, basically creating it for me. So you need to kind of be, whether you are conscious of it or not, you're part of, by virtue of your human biology system, et cetera, you're part of a larger ecosystem. And so you can, potentially create this whole virtuous cycle around that. So
interesting.
Yeah, definitely. So it's, I'm kind of
I had a question.
Go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
So we started, one of the things we said way back at the start of our conversation was technological blow-ups. So you want to make any comments about security, right? People trying to game your voting system, thinking of ways to subvert it.
Yeah, it's definitely a concern I have, both, at the lower level code level and the other thing. And I think the way that we've evolved is to, alongside the code, deploy kind of the intent of the code and have a legal framework in a kind of context of a nonprofit that is, meant to basically enforce the intent of the code insofar as it needs to be that. And I think maybe at some point we can move off of a system like that, but for the time being, it makes sense to do this kind of with the training wheels. Mm-hmm. And also makes sense to like really only take people on to the project that are really aligned with the overall goals of the project in the kind of long-term fashion. And I think like we had very similar intentions when we launched, say, 3 years ago, the original concept as far as what we wanted to do. But a lot of the people who were on, they were still in this sort of pump and dump kind of mindset a little bit, and not really in it for the long haul, or they just didn't have the stamina and things like that. So even and that's totally understandable. But I think we just want a good container so that we can be sure that we deliver on the value that we intend to do. So
okay.
We're doing this. We're selling off, not unlike the DAO, and the DAO basically sold off 100% of the voting shares, and then everyone can vote on everything. We're selling off a much smaller percentage of that, and so to a certain degree, it's much more like a startup where the founders retain control of it, a significant amount of control, and then other people have a voice to kind of interfere if the founders go a little too far off. So I think.
Gotcha.
I think in that sense, we're not trying to run it like a giant, democratic experiment with, everyone voting on everything and, having that be a potential risk at the kind of, for instance, if we're buying Amazonian rainforest, that then some faction would come in and try and basically sell it, burn it all, and then, whatever they want to do. So
yeah, like you said, it's it's training wheels, which is a good stepping stone to actually doing something even more innovative in the future.
Yeah, I've gotten a pretty good idea of a better idea of what you're doing. Have you said everything you wanted to say? I'm thinking what I learned was, so you're thinking about voting mechanisms on the blockchain. You thought about basically representative democracy to avoid burdening people with too much work. You talked about how factions can fight the oligarchy concerns. You talked about using positive incentives instead of guns, right? Negative incentives and you talked about tying things to hard assets. Have you said everything you wanted to say? Does that cover pretty much a lot?
Well, yeah, you had mentioned the outset you maybe want to talk about the end of the white paper, which is sort of comparisons to the DAO. I don't know if there's anything that stood out to you there.
I got a chance to ask about the differences as far as also it being based on potentially real estate as well, which was pretty cool. And based on, I think the other point that's in here is based on long and short-term stake. So we touched upon that, and prototype reputational system that says trust currency. So I don't think we got a chance to talk about that. But I guess you're talking about some sort of rep system inherent inside the liquid democracy. As far as like good decisions, bad decisions, and earning reputation from that.
Yeah, I'll use the kind of hard assets thing to illustrate that, and I think the DAO is interesting in the sense that they had $150 million plus dollars. How would that have been allocated? Would it have gone to things that provided real value? And I think at that time probably there weren't enough of like legitimate value things to really allocate that efficiently. Not that, and the governance mechanism maybe wouldn't have actually allowed for efficient allocation of capital anyways. And I think by focusing on hard assets, and we have kind of curated deal opportunities, my business partners are both sort of very astute tech entrepreneurs that have gone into finance to varying degrees. We have things that represent extremely good opportunities with both in real estate and elsewhere, things like art markets. And the really cool thing, and this is where trust currency comes in, is, we can take the recommendations of other people to say, hey, like this person happens to be really good at deploying capital into real estate, rather than, and this is actually something that like an AngelList syndicate goes, like works a similar way, where you say, this person seems to really know what are good startup deals. I'll just follow him. And then basically when he deploys capital, I'll also deploy capital. So, right. And you get a notification and say, oh, do you want to like follow along with this deal that's happening at a given point? And cool. Interestingly enough, like nothing like that really exists for a lot of other aspects of the world. I think AngelList is doing it pretty well, but if I want to do that real estate, so, and the reputation and trust currency, as we're calling it, is a really good way of knowing whether or not someone is actually a good person to follow or not. I say, oh, this guy, you can actually see based on the reputation he's accrued in the system, whether or not it's actually a good place to put your money. So
gotcha. Yeah. Cool. That is pretty like big dynamic that I think everybody is expecting to be huge, like in blockchain, as far as like credit and reputation and tying people to a whole bunch of value inside the system that they're not being tied to right now, since all these different reputation and credit systems and investment, a person's investment history, or these things are all scattered amongst 6 different companies or 6 different databases. But with a blockchain, all that would be tokenized, I guess you're saying, in some sense, and tied together to get like a person's full, if they wanted to, a person's full like investment history and credit and everything would all be tied together. Is that right? In some sense, or not really?
Well, yes. I mean, in the sense that AngelList, ties these things together. So
right.
It doesn't have to be. It's not going to necessarily be the only platform for everything. And I personally am sort of have crypto and anonymity or pseudonymity as a goal on some things. And I think that having multiple identities can be useful for different things. So you might have like, I have some Pepe Cash actually, and if I'm recommending which rare Pepes to buy, I might do that under a different avatar than some other other one that I'm doing real estate recommendations. So yeah, I think that's fine.
Yeah, you might want to keep those pseudonyms separate. That would be a good idea.
Right. But is the reason that you brought up the DAO, Carlo and Joel, because you were concerned that there would, or Joel, that people would compare what you're doing to the DAO, and so that's why you had to address that?
Yeah, it happened in the first time I circulated these concepts.
Okay.
That people said, oh, that's like the DAO 2.0 with better governance and everything else. And then I, realized that it was worth explaining the ways in which it was and wasn't like the DAO.
Okay. Yeah. I think it's a shame that now every complex contract is going to remind people of the DAO. But I think even people that maybe haven't read the white paper, just knowing that you're acknowledging that misunderstanding exists and you have arguments, I think people know that you're doing something about it, and it's not going to be like the DAO.
I talked about it at the very beginning of the show. I want to ask you a little bit more about Agentic, it's called, right? Agentic, and the sustainability alliance between the UN and blockchain and stuff like that.
Yeah, Agentic Group is doing great stuff right now, and really building, a kind of portfolio over, high-level advice on blockchain usage to, central bankers and kind of governance, around the world. And I was really fortunate to work with them on this Brazil project. And there were a lot of people there, from the World Bank and, people doing stuff at the UN and other sort of international organizations. and a lot of momentum that came out of it, so much so that we created this sort of change the world with blockchain, foundation and kind of like hackathon that's going to be happening in about a month. So on May 13th and 14th is the sort of general dates. And I think some of the people who were there really got, I think, in Brazil, there's a knowledge that some of the governmental systems are not working particularly well at this moment. And a lot of energy. This may put a little mildly, maybe, but
yeah, I was going to say you're doing some understatements there, but that's those are like really. You're getting really good at politics, man. This is it. that was top notch.
Well, yeah, I guess I'm gonna need to do a lot of that as I travel. But these sort of transparent systems are potentially a much better way of managing some of these processes, and a lot of young energy that kind of came together of people who are like, yeah, we're ready to kind of rise to the challenge of building something that's better and actually deploying it in Brazil right now. So I actually Ethereum was first launched and the white paper came out. Vitalik made the announcement. It was at the North American Bitcoin thing in Miami. And I really felt that like this in Brazil was kind of a catalyzing moment in a similar way that one was, where all these people were coming together with a really positive vision, but also extremely capable and knowledgeable in their various sort of subdomains. So,
right.
I'm very committed, to kind of taking these things to the next level and really, facilitating this process. So,
sounds cool. Yeah,
and Agentic people, other people involved with that are really, really top notch and great. And we're actively open to other kind of sponsors too for these events who are sort of committed to the idea of changing the world with blockchain. So that's
cool. Awesome.
Yeah. Cool. So I don't know if there's, we're now into a little bit past an hour. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to talk about, Joel, or anything you wanted to ask Christian?
No, I think the conversation's been pretty thorough. I've asked all the questions and addressed the concerns I had, and I think I have a lot better idea of what you're doing. So thank you.
Joel,
thank you guys. And
go ahead.
Just welcome people to, participate in any of these initiatives, even if it's just, creating a GitHub issue or whatever else, or, but like I said, I'm really committed to building these sort of transparent, systems and going into places where there's a huge need for it. So.
Okay, very cool. And so for anybody out there listening, we're going to post some links below. We're going to have the white paper that we were talking about, as well as maybe a link to Agentic and some other stuff. As many relevant links as we can get, we're going to put them in the description below for anyone listening on YouTube. And thank you, Joel, for coming on with us. And Christian, anybody listening, thank you guys for listening. And good to be back after my Japan, Shanghai, Malta trip. And I'll see you guys next week. Thank you for IOHK for helping us make the show possible. And thank you to the ETC community and all the ETC devs and everyone out there listening. Appreciate you guys. Take care.
Hey, bye-bye.
Bye.
If you are passionate about anything related to Ethereum Classic and you have something to say, we'd love to discuss that with you on the show. We're always looking for interesting guests, so don't